Okay. So it should say recording.
And there were a few buzzes there a moment ago. I don't know if in the audio. I'm not quite sure why. That may have just been setting up on your side.
Yeah, no, I just heard a buzz too. There might be some buzzes once in a while where it's not perfect.
No worries.
Hopefully it'll be good enough. People expect a little bit of that once in a while. So
yeah. Well, I like to say, what I say about my background. One thing this crisis is sort of teaching us is we're all humans. We're all people with families at home. We all have houses. We have noisy kids, maybe, or cats, or and the guy that teller behind the counter at the bank is a human too, and your suppliers and your customers, they're all humans, and this helps show that the mistakes, the little glitches. We don't need to be smooth and perfect as much as we did 3 or 4 weeks ago.
So true.
There's a positive change coming from this.
Yeah, it's great. All right, ready to start?
Let's go for it.
Okay, let's do it. Hi, Systems for Success family. I am super excited that in this episode, I get the opportunity to interview, was that your computer or mine?
I don't think it was mine. But let me close my Outlook just to make sure that it doesn't do that.
I'm going to do the same thing here. It might have been mine.
And I mean, this, a Windows is sort of thing that it's still going to pop up and beep at the wrong time. It's just going to happen, but at least we've closed as much as we can. I guess that's probably a very good point,
Yeah. Okay. So if it happens, we can pause and start over and we'll just edit it out. So, All right, start again.
Okay.
All right. Hi, Systems for Success family. I'm super excited today that in this episode, I get the opportunity to interview a man who has a ton of experience. He's a great business leader and he's a great family leader, and he comes from a world-renowned family, Pierre DuPont. Over the last couple years, I've had the privilege of getting to develop a bit of a friendship with Pierre and developed a high level of respect for him. And the more we've gotten to know each other, the more I realized that Pierre has a very similar passion that grows out of his own family experience, a passion to help other family leaders and business leaders create a more positive, multi-generational legacy. So let me tell you just a bit about Pierre DuPont before we get into the official interview here. What I like about Pierre's story is that he likes to say that he was born lucky twice. Something like 218 years ago, his father's family founded the DuPont Company, and that side of the family has been like in the top 15 to 20 wealthiest families in the country. And his mother's family founded their family business endeavors also over 200 years ago, and today still employs over 40,000 people around the country. So Pierre is one of those rare leaders who's been able to experience many of the positives and negatives of working on this multi-generational legacy and wealth transfer process. And the lessons that he's learned from 6 or 7 generations of successful and probably some not so successful family cohesion processes, I'm sure will be extraordinarily valuable to all of us. And Pierre on his own is a semi-retired, successful entrepreneur. He is a private investor, a mentor, and advisor for other business leaders and family leaders. 6 years ago, I think it was, that he kind of unretired to help develop Cerity Partners with a focus on, I think, leveraging the learnings from what his ancestors did to propagate fairly successfully their businesses and family cohesion across many decades, and figure out how to help other families with those learnings. So with that introduction, Pierre, officially welcome to the show.
Thank you, Lonnie. I'm glad to be here, and you overstated so many things in that introduction that I don't know where to begin, but it was good.
I think might be understated in several cases here, which we'll find out in a second. So, Pierre, clearly you come from 2 very interesting multi-generational family legacies, with the DuPont family on your dad's side, the R.D. Wood family on your mom's side. Can you just tell us a bit more about your family history and fill in some of the blanks that I didn't cover?
Um, sure. It's a sort of long history, kind of before I'm in the picture. My father's family did begin. The son of a man who had my name, Pierre DuPont, also, but his son founded what today is known as the DuPont Company in 1802. Basically on the principle that gunpowder that they could buy in America, they were new immigrants into America at that time, was relatively poor compared to what he could manufacture. He knew manufacturing techniques that were safer and better in various ways. And that's began the DuPont Company. We haven't been in gunpowder and explosives in many, many decades, but that was the beginning of it about 200 years ago now. Similarly, my mother's family, about the same time, started a business, an ironmongery, an iron foundry business, which does not continue today, but that evolved oddly into a dairy and then into a convenience store chain known as Wawa. And those listeners who are sort of southeastern U.S. will know of Wawa and the great passions, mostly positive, that are rise around it, because it's a pretty cool convenience store, as convenience stores go. And so both of those families are pretty large. And as a kid growing up, they were present. And those histories were present in mostly positive, but occasionally not so positive ways. And so that's kind of why
So
I'm doing what I do today.
How many cousins are there in your, just on the DuPont side?
You know, I should have gone and asked that question before we got on here, because I probably knew you were going to ask that. But back around Thanksgiving time, when I last asked the little family office that the DuPont family has, there were, I believe the answer was 3,865 living genetic cousins, and somewhat more than 1,000 married spouses, all alive today. Those 3,800 plus 1,000 alive today. My mother's family, that number, I don't have it quite so accurately, but it's somewhere in the scale of 200 living descendants. But we only track that back to the founding of Wawa as we know it today, which was about 100 years ago, even though the family business
only 100 years.
Yeah. So, but I'll tell you, most families over 100 years will end up with a couple hundred people in them. And that's an interesting question and an interesting challenge for thinking about inherited wealth and inherited businesses.
Yeah, that's why clearly you've put a lot of thought into this, because you come from these two rich family heritages. And I know on the DuPont side, you had a DuPont family member as the CEO of the company for what, 170 years or something?
Yeah, something like that. And I think it becomes a little debatable, because you know, there are people who marry in, and are they family members or not? They are, definitely, but you know, but in any case, yeah, the last sort of basically family member, I think stopped being CEO in about 1970. But truthfully, I think the last real family member, real control, and really leading, would be my great grandfather's first cousin. And there were three at that level, cousins, who kind of ran the company from about 1910, call it, until the 50s. Even though the company was public at that point, they tightly controlled it and ran it. And it was really at that time frame that I think the family control began to seriously diminish. And today, very little involvement. Full disclosure, my brother's on the board, but he's very good at not saying anything, so I don't know anything.
And obviously still quite a few family members who are stockholders in the company. And then on the Wawa side, on your mom's side, completely different, where that's a private company, still privately held, right?
Yes, absolutely. And so there's a great distinction there, public, private. And they provide great material for me to contemplate, how any given company ought to evolve, being able to see both very large, successful private company, very large, successful public company, and how they are different because of how they are owned and how they are controlled through public shares, through private shares, and there are learnings and positives and negatives on both sides, of course.
Yeah, very interesting. I think on your mom's side of the family, that line of business has had a family member as CEO until just a few years ago, if I remember the story right.
Indeed. My Uncle Richard, Uncle Dick, my mother's brother, has been the CEO for, I want to say, about 50 years now. But he retired from that role maybe 5 years ago, and he only dropped off the board, I believe, on January 1st, on December 31st. So he formally has no involvement at this point. Well, of course he does, because I'm sure many people contact Uncle Dick when there are key questions to be addressed. He's a very smart man and very good at it.
Sure. And I love the story how with that side of the family business, you have what, 15,000 or so employees that participate in an employee stock ownership program. So
Yep.
part of the company is actually owned by employees, and
Yep. And
privately.
I'll give Uncle Dick that. I don't give it to him. He deserves that credit. I believe he was drawn to wanting to have employee ownership soon after the ERISA laws were created. I want to say in the late 70s, that allowed employee stock ownership plans to come into existence. He created one, and it's a great benefit for the people, the employees, but it's also a great benefit for the company to have people that become that committed, because it's their company. And so that's been a wonderful thing.
That's fantastic. So thanks for that helpful background on the rich long-term business and family legacy on both sides of your family. Tell us just a little bit about your immediate family, Pierre.
Well, I actually I got born lucky a third time. I should say I married. Was the third piece of luck in my life. This woman, Jenny, who gets most of the credit, including for driving me along in the positive ways that I need to be driven. We have 4 kids, 4 children, basically all grown, all mid-20s, late 20s, all kind of in the beginnings of their careers and doing quite well. And I really want to have some of their lives. In fact, they look very, very great from where I'm sitting. Proud of them, but boy, it would be fun to be doing what they're all doing.
That's great. Well, they've obviously had a great example with you and their mom, and the two of you leading the way. And you've, of course, as I mentioned, you've started a number of successful businesses yourself, and including taking some public. And so you've got all this experience, and now you're at a stage in your life where you are really spending a lot of time giving back to other families and business leaders to help them understand how to grapple with what wealth means to them and their family, and how to pass on the best of what wealth means to them to future generations. And I think that's just a wonderful thing, so inspiring for me to see another leader who's so committed to that. So let me start with this foundational question, Pierre. When you talk about passing wealth on to future generations, how do you define wealth?
Right. Well, you can have a lot of fun with that, answering that question and taking the various perspectives that come with that answer, with the answers. So most people think of wealth as money. Sure, that's probably the most common definition, and most wealth probably is some form of money. But I want to go much further, because I think wealth can be things that you might need money, or maybe don't need money to acquire, to possess. Art. A library, a park that you help to create in your community. Those are pieces of wealth, or forms of wealth also. And really, I think the fullest, going as far as you can in that direction, into these sort of softer and less obvious forms of wealth, I really think it comes down to sort of principles and understandings and heritage, and a wealth of ideas and concepts that you might want to pass on in your family, or maybe even a wealth of opportunities you want to create for future descendants, or help them create for themselves. Those are forms of wealth too, and they're very soft and squishy and kind of hard to define and talk about. But I think that's important to recognize, that it's not just money. It's the things that make you who you are, the things that made you successful. It's the things that you are doing in the communities around you. Those things are wealth of a kind, and you can pass them along also, and you can use them to propagate wealth in some sense too. And that's kind of what I mean by the broader definitions of wealth.
Yeah, that's fantastic. So along those lines, Pierre, if you had to define kind of the advantages and disadvantages of financial wealth versus wealth of values, vision, principles, traditions. How would you compare and contrast those two and the process of and importance of passing those on to future generations?
All right, this is going to take some time to figure out that answer to that question and talk it through. But let's do that. So financial wealth, money, basically. And by the way, all forms of wealth can have positives and negatives in terms of the impact on future descendants. So that's an important starting point. But particularly financial wealth, I think, has the greatest chance of negative impact. And that's the classic silver spoon problem. You know, if your young children grow up flying around on private jets and living in phenomenal houses with butlers with silver trays, that puts a certain perspective on their lives, which is not very commonly shared. And that, I think, has a risk of becoming more negative. It can still be positive, but it has a risk of becoming negative. So financial wealth has positive and negative impacts. The other things, whether it's some sort of community endeavor that you care about, maybe a philanthropy that you care about, those forms of wealth that you're maybe passing along or having your family help you to propagate, I think they have less risk of being negative. And mostly being positive, positive impact on your town, on a set of people who are benefiting from that, and to use that within your family to show your children, your descendants, how to bring that benefit, that needed philanthropic endeavor to people, the people in that particular community. That's a really great positive you get from that. And indeed, financial wealth can also generate that kind of positive. You can use that financial wealth 20 years from now to do something that's important for some communities, whether it's a museum or shoes for children in a certain part of the world or whatever. So both financial wealth and non-financial wealth can do very positive things, and they have some negatives with them too. I think the financial wealth has probably a greater risk of negative impact upon descendants.
Yeah. It's very true. And what seems to be the case, the more I talk with other family leaders who are thinking about these things on an intergenerational basis, is that if we don't really focus on intentionally passing on the non-financial wealth, especially the principles, the values, the heritage, as you said, of who we are, what we stand for, if we don't focus on that first, then any financial wealth that's created in one generation is less likely to be sustained and developed in future generations. Have you seen that?
Yes, and as you were saying that question, I was sort of developing a slightly different answer to where your question ended. But where your question ended was that the financial wealth might not itself be propagated successfully if you're not thoughtful about it when you start today. I think, but yes, that is correct. And I think what I was thinking of in my head was two examples of why you need to think about that wealth and how it will be propagated down the genetic tree, if you will, or down the tree of time. That may illuminate the question you were trying to get to. So, simple example, you're going to create, you're a wealthy individual, you decide to create a trust for a grandchild who's born yesterday, great thing. So you take $100,000 and put it in this trust. And like many people, the trust goes until the child is 21, and lo and behold, they get the money. And they get $100,000 times whatever, multiplication would have occurred over 21 years. So it's probably 500,000 or a million or whatever it is. Well, hang on a second. A 21-year-old kid suddenly gets $1 million check. Whoa, that could go bad very easily, right? I mean, do you really want that 100? And by the way, does that child know it's coming? Does, when he's 16, 17, 18, does he know, or does she know that there's going to be $1 million check when he or she turns 21? You got to be real
how's that
careful.
impact them if they know it, right?
Right. So you got to be real careful about thinking that one through before you just go off and create that wonderful trust for a kid who's going to turn 21 someday. And the same problem applies if you say, well, they get it when they're 35. Same problem. Do they know it's coming? And there are positives and negatives to that. So that's one example. Another example would be, let's say you have a philanthropy that has been very successful and is important to you and your family, and you arrange for that to be carried on and for your children and grandchildren to be continued to direct that philanthropy and guide it. Well, hang on, that great grandchild who sort of someday they have to decide, they have to be able to make decisions about that philanthropy. They have to be able to come together as a family and agree what they're going to do in a hard time like maybe today. How are they going to survive with their budgets through this next 3 months in that philanthropy? And unless they're communicating well, unless they're prepared for it, they're not going to make a good decision. They're going to make the wrong decisions, and the philanthropy is going to begin to sort of deteriorate. And you can see if that happens a few times, the thing begins to fall apart eventually, and it stops being able to give the benefit that you thought it would be giving 50 years from now. So again, you need to think through, not just that you've created it and launched it on its way, but how is it going to be interacting with your family, and how's the family going to be interacting with it over the next 10, 20, 50, 100 years if it goes on that long.
Yep. What I liked about your two illustrations, the first one, the next generation had little to no participation in what they receive, right? And your second example of participating in philanthropy, the next generation is involved in making decisions while both generations or multiple generations are still alive. They're actually involved in the process.
Yep. And that involvement can be a challenge. I mean, family dynamics in any family, can be complex. We all have an Aunt Jane or an Uncle Joe who's a little strange, and we kind of, so there are always, people evolve, families change, they grow, and when you bring these different people together and they have to make a decision, you need to think that through. How's that decision going to be made? Who's going to make that decision, and how are they going to be communicating? And that's the theme I'll come back to often: communication. How are they going to be communicating in the days, weeks, months, years before any given decision? Because if they're not communicating before the decision, the communication likely is to go badly at the moment they have to make the decision.
Yep. Let's talk a bit more about communication, as you just alluded to. I know that's a favorite theme of yours, the value of communication for families. And can you talk about what makes for good communication in families, and maybe give some examples of how that works in your family?
Sure. I think the phrase I've been using in the last couple of months that I kind of like is you need to establish, it'd be most effective if you establish traditions of open and safe communications within the family. Traditions is important. This can't be something, it's not one and done. Yeah, we had a great meeting, good, we'll do it again a few years later, don't worry about it. That doesn't work. It's got to be a tradition of communications, whatever those things might be. It has to be open. Everyone who is going to be involved in the decision, and really everyone in the family, has to have a voice, has to be able to participate if they want to. Some are very good at that participation and some are not. That's fine. But you have to give everyone the opportunity and be open about it. And it's got to be safe. It's got to be done without judgment. The fact that I've got a cousin Jane who says this really weird thing, we can't laugh about that. We can't think it's really weird. We have to be tolerant to say, okay, it's an interesting opinion. It doesn't quite align with what we imagined you might say, cousin Jane, but that's good. It's great. Let's talk about it. You've brought something to our attention, so be safe. And don't criticize and don't be judgmental. And so putting together the communication tools that generate those traditions of open, safe communications, I don't know if there's a simple answer to that question, but that I think is the goal, particularly if you want to have something carry on long beyond after long beyond when you are gone, and you will be gone, unfortunately, someday. So figuring that out well in advance, is the goal.
Can you give us some examples of some of the traditions that foster communication like that you've had either historically or currently in your families?
Sure. The simplest and most obvious one is family meetings, family events. I'm really quite blessed in my father's family. We have a very, very long, multi-100-year tradition of family get-together on January 1st. And I'll tell you, as a little kid, getting up at 6 a.m. on January 1st, New Year's Day morning, to go off to this party was sometimes a little odd, but it was a lot of fun too. But that tradition is something we all in my father's extended family know about, and many of us participate in it, when it's possible, and so on. But that gives us a common bond right there, a common piece of communication. We all call each other cousins. None of us remember names, so there are badges, with your name on it, just paper sticky badges. But because we do that, I think there's an openness that says that I could very likely call up any of my cousins and say, hey, I happen to be in your neck of the woods in Botswana next month. Can I come have a cup of coffee? And I imagine that pretty much any of my families would not find that terribly odd to receive that phone call. And, maybe most people in the world wouldn't find it odd either, but, I think that's a benefit of having these regular family get-togethers. And we do something
So are you
similar
saying that,
family, but.
are you saying that legitimately you could call up, any of your hundreds of cousins or thousands of cousins, I guess, as you might look at it, and say, let's do coffee, and you can sit down and talk, and like, could you ask them for a favor and they wouldn't think it was weird? Like, is there
okay. So, I mean, first of all, Lonnie, you could do this too. So you have, cousins in your family, your parents had cousins. I am quite sure that if you called up them, now, the fact that they don't know you exist, maybe some of those distant cousins, is a whole other problem. You get a call from this guy named Lonnie claims I'm a cousin. And, well, I don't know, that's kind of weird, right? At least in my family, and certainly with my name, that's a relatively easy thing to do, to call up anyone in the family. But again, I think that the fact that we do have these events means, I really think I'd be very likely to be successful that any of my cousins that I was able to find the phone number for, another problem right there. So that's another piece of communication we'll get to. But if I could find that phone number or that email address and pop them a message saying, hey, I'm your cousin, and I think it wouldn't really matter if my name were, Fred, Fred Smith or Pierre DuPont. And say, I'm your cousin, and I might even say I'm on chart 73, by the way, and that's another piece of communication. I'll come back to what that means in a moment. Chart 73.
Okay.
Yeah. They would be likely to say, oh, sure, well, I'm busy that day, I can't do it, but or they say, sure, yeah, okay, no problem, or why don't you call me? I think that would work. And I'm lucky to be able to say that. I've done it maybe twice in life, but I think that's an important part of the communication within a family, is to set up a mechanism to allow that to happen, to make it possible.
Yeah, that's so powerful. I mean, Pierre, you just hearing your story really fires up my passion and imagination for what I would love to see from my family 7 generations from now. Where, I mean, can you imagine, all of you are listening who, have families that you lead. Can you imagine what it'd be like if you knew that 7, 8 generations from now, there were hundreds or thousands of people that are your descendants who still actually feel some kind of bond of affinity as a family to the broader family. I mean, that's so powerful. So hearing, just one example of one tradition of a January 1 gathering where I'm sure you have hundreds of people, right, that get together and loved at some point. Yeah. So talk about chart 73.
Let me jump into another piece of that. I mentioned chart 73. I think that's my chart number. I've forgotten, actually. Maybe it's 78. I think it's 73. I haven't looked in a while. In my father's family, we have a very big genealogy, and it comes out every 5 years or so. And let's not get into those details. But let me give you the better example of a genealogy, which is, and I'm on chart 73 in my father's family's genealogy book, page 73. Okay, so just to give you an idea of the magnitude of that book. Nonetheless, my mother's family, the Wood family, we have this wonderful tradition also of a annual party. When I was a kid, and even really a little bit today, this was, the family getting together to talk about the business and maybe make some decisions around that business as a family. Well, as the business has gotten bigger, and, most family members are not involved in the business. 200 family members wouldn't be involved in any business likely. The actual decision-making has become less and less and less. But nonetheless, it's important for the business to be presented to the family and for the family to have a chance to interact with the business. And that's what we do once a year. And we have a particular time we do that. So my Uncle Dick, my mother's brother, has this wonderful tradition. We have a genealogy, and I should have brought an example to show. It's basically about 5 pages accordion folded together. There's sort of one long piece of paper. And it's the family tree. And there are, all the obvious branches in it. And there are my 4 kids here. And that's me and now my wife. And then there are, my siblings too, and my mom and my dad and my grandfather and so on. So Uncle Dick blows that thing up and puts it on the wall, 25 feet long in this big conference room we're all sitting in. And at the beginning of every meeting, he stands up with a laser pointer and says, "Welcome, cousins. And we especially want to welcome, Richie and Jane, who had a baby this last year on February 4th, and they put the laser pointer on it. That's the baby right there on the tree. Everyone clap for those cousins." And he'll go through and do the 1 or 2 babies there. Maybe there are 3, 5, 10 of them that pop. And that is so wonderful to sort of call that out. It's maybe a little embarrassing too, but it's cool. It's a great thing. And he does also, he doesn't do this so pointedly, but he does mention that we also have lost a few relatives. And typically it's not very many because the tree is still pretty flat. But, mention them too. And again, use the genealogy to show they're over there on that branch, and use your laser pointer to point there. And then at the coffee breaks, everyone's wandering up and having a look at this big thing. Of course, we all take a copy of it home, right? So we all have that accordion genealogy too. That's something you could do very easily. And even if your family today is one, it's you and your wife and your bunch of kids and maybe some grandkids, get them on that family. It's pretty small, 1 page, no problem. But if you establish the tradition of having that exist and be updated at a particular time and maintained by someone, not you, Lonnie, someone else in your family who keeps that up to date, and you put in place the responsibility, the method for succession of that responsibility for keeping that genealogy up to date and seeing it gets distributed around, and you make that work as a tradition, that'll still be gone 50, 100 years from now. And then you'll have built exactly what my Uncle Dick points to on the wall at every family meeting.
I love that. And again, the power in this podcast is called Systems for Success, because we talk about a lot the power of systems or processes or traditions.
That's what it
is.
Things that you repeat.
Yeah, things that you repeat on a regular basis that reinforce what's important to you or your family or your business. Mm-hmm. And that's a great system. I've talked to another multi-generation family that told me that their similar tradition is they have a location that they do there. Yep. They meet twice a year as an extended family, and they're up to about 400 and some people that gather now every year. So it's several generations later. But they have a huge barn. It's a family property. They have a huge barn in that location. And inside they have a huge wall in the barn that they literally have everybody, all 400 and some people's pictures with strings between them. And they have this big ceremony every year where they put up the new pictures, the new spouses, the new kids born, and perfect. Celebrate them.
I love it.
So similar concept towards a tradition like
love
that.
It. That's great. Yep.
You talk a bit about I think the power of memorializing locations also. Talk a bit about that, what you've done along those lines.
So locations come in a couple different flavors. There are in my view sort of the business and the source of wealth locations. And I'm reminded of a story I heard of years ago, and I met the family that did this. A gentleman my age, his father had been in a particular piece of the chemicals business, unrelated to the DuPont company, no relation at all. And he had, back in the 70s, gone over to, and it was a small business then, but nonetheless, it was a business in a particular flavor of some chemistry thing. And as a result of that, there's one company in Europe that also did that same kind of chemical business. And so when that business began to fail in some way, they called up this guy in America and said, "Hey, do you want to buy our business?" So he went over to look at the factory, which would have been the asset he was buying in the early 70s. But they told him, "Because you're our competitors, actually, we're not going to let you in the building." So he walked the perimeter of the fence with his binoculars and just had a look, walked around it, and somehow came to the conclusion that, yep, he should go ahead and buy this business. And of course, he looked at all the papers and the P&L and so on, but he concluded to buy it. But that walking around the perimeter. So I come in the picture now, 30, 40 years later. This would have been about 10 years ago, I suppose. And I'm hearing this from the grown son saying, and you know what? About 5 years later, he took all his kids to go walk the perimeter of that plant that they still owned. And in fact, that plant became the basis of their now much more valuable success. And so that location they want to memorialize. And so they go there. They have a tradition every 5 years of going to that place and walking around that perimeter, just as take a picnic lunch on your back and walk the perimeter with your grandkids, with your kids. And that is the beginning of a tradition to memorialize a location. That's a fun example.
Yeah. And what I love about that is you don't have to have, a big company or a big plant to have some kind of a tradition related to a place that's meaningful to your family.
Actually, I forgot to say, that plant no longer exists. It's literally an empty field.
Oh.
Okay. But still, it was the location. I mean, of course, the factory got old. They tore it down. They built a new one 5 miles down the road, whatever. But it's still that location. And that's pretty cool.
Right. So, that's fantastic.
So you can do that with those kind of locations. Yes.
Yep. And things that are not location based, I imagine your family's done things like private websites, newsletters, things like that also, right?
Yeah, it's funny. I went upstairs yesterday. I happened to walk by my wife and she was playing a video that had my father speaking. Whoa, okay. Well, it turns out she was on the family genealogy website. We have a family website that I have not been on in maybe 5 or 6 years, and it's evolved a lot recently. And she was looking at a video from some party, 20 years ago. And whoa, pretty cool. So and I had nothing to do with that. So, yes, indeed. Again, it's hard when you're the mom and the dad and you're having your success and you got these 3 little kids, or maybe they're grown kids, to create a website for you. That's a little hard at that stage, right? But you might want to think about that. If there are, stories to put there, videos to put there. Now, security is an issue and technology is all kinds of problems. And maybe you can't do it as a result. But if you could, even though it's only you and your kids and maybe a grandchild or two, start that tradition and have some fun writing the stories, picking the photos every year to put up there. Not every photo can go there. I've got, 15,000 photos in my Google Photos drive. No one wants to look at that stuff. But if I had been taking the time, and I did not, every, Christmas to go through with my kids and pick 10 pictures from the last year that we like best, and let's put those in a special place, that would have become that tradition. Actually, we did do that for a long while. We used to give, before we had digital photos, we used to give a photo album to my wife on our anniversary. My kids and I would put together a photo album, and we have about 10 years of that, of sort of pictures that summarize the past year. And I really am sorry we sort of lost that tradition, because that was cool, and now it's too complicated because there are just too many photos, right? It's hard to sort all that out. Anyway.
Yeah, which points out again the power of traditions only lasts as long as you kind of have somebody that's reinforcing the repetition of those traditions. I got to
think a little bit about why we stopped doing that. I think it was just a matter that one year things were too busy, too many soccer practices, whatever, and we didn't get around to it, and suddenly it's too late, and it faded. But again, systems would have helped keep that going, and that was a good one, I think. I got to recreate
certainly
that.
And some traditions can be replaced by others. We did some family photo albums. We have our daughter, Lachelle, it's great at that kind of thing for a while. And then we actually did just in the last year launch our own private family legacy website.
Good.
And it's great fun. We have our whole family tree on one section. We've got, each of our family members' mission, vision, values. And
now you pointed me to a couple of videos about your family. Were they actually sort of on that website? I just wasn't inside it when I looked at them.
Right. Yeah. I pulled off of just to let you see a bit about our family, a couple of videos. So we have a bunch of videos about each of our values from Shelley and I. There's a section of the website for each of our 3 married, actually each of our 4 kids, and the 3 married, have a deeper section for theirs, where we do actually try and capture pictures of milestone events for each one of the families on a regular basis,
Yeah.
because there is so many pictures now of so many things.
Yeah.
It's hard to know what do you capture. So we have a
Yeah.
definition for that. So we're just
Excellent.
experimenting with that, and we used. Well, I couldn't have done it myself. We used a company called FamilyLegacyTrove.com that's
Yeah.
great at helping families do this, and
Okay.
so it makes it relatively simple. You just have to collect the information and sit in front of a camera some. So it works good. So. Well, thank you for that background on what you mean by establishing regular, safe, open communications and traditions that reinforce that. That's super valuable, Pierre. I want to just talk a bit about kind of the converse of this here. I mean, you're a real life, well, you're currently living in a real life case study of two families that have managed to pass some forms of wealth and tradition and good communication habits on to 6-7 generations. Most families that have some things that they're proud of don't pass those things that they are proud of on past maybe the second, maybe some of it to the third generation. It's the concept of shirt sleeves to shirt sleeves in 3 generations, right?
Yeah.
So question for you, Pierre, is first of all, what is this saying shirt sleeves to shirt sleeves and 3 generations mean, and why is it so prevalent?
Yeah. Okay. Well, I suspect it's prevalent because if you were able to study the question sort of rigorously, and you looked at thousands, millions, billions of people and their families, you would find this 3 sort of cycle thing. And so what it means basically is the first generation creates some business or does something along those lines to make a bunch of wealth. The second generation grows up while that is happening, and sees it. And then depending upon how well, and usually not very well, they are engaged in the growth of that success and the success itself, they then carry it on. It has momentum. It has a magnitude that when the original founder, he or she dies, the next generation kind of carries it on, no problem. But they may not be contributing the way that their father or mother was when he or she created the business. And so the business will be good, but it's not maybe growing and evolving the way businesses kind of need to do in the world today, particularly. And then their kids are now growing up and they're not maybe seeing all that success, or maybe more specifically, they are getting the benefit of the financial success in having great schooling, great houses, great cars, great cell phones, but the money gets consumed. So that when they become of age and their parents die, they've been living with a lot of wealth, but haven't really thought about producing it. And therefore, it's kind of gone in their generation. That's sort of I'm not sure I'm saying that very clearly, but that's sort of the 3-step process that is shirt sleeves to shirt sleeves. Because then, that generation now has to go make a living. They have to work because the inherited money is beginning to fade and disappear, and the business is gone. Maybe it's been sold or whatever. So the third and certainly the fourth generation, then, they've got nothing. They have to start from scratch again. So they're back in shirt sleeves, working hard again.
I'd like to expand the process you just described as applying to financial wealth to some of the other forms of wealth, because I don't know about you, but I see this with other forms of wealth also, with values, with spirituality, with those core character traits. So for instance, it's fairly common to see one generation that may have very high values or deep level of spirituality that drives those values, and some of that may get passed on to the next generation. But if that next generation isn't really involved in what created that spirituality, or the spiritual disciplines, for instance, or practices, they either take it for granted, or it's just something their parents did, so it begins to wane.
Yep.
And by the time you get to the third generation, they're still benefiting from the good values or morals or spiritual foundations that 2 or 3 generations ago had, but they don't realize where that benefit came from or how it got there, right?
Sure.
They didn't realize the hard work a prior generation did to develop that depth of character, for instance.
Yeah.
Anyway, I see that over and over again with other types of wealth too. So expanding it to all forms of wealth. The key question is, how do you break that cycle, Pierre?
So as I was hearing you talk that through, I have not thought about it so much in the sort of spiritual values, principles sense of shirt sleeves to shirt sleeves, but you said it well. And that I'm sure that happens, and it makes perfect sense, actually. And here's the challenge. You said it, in fact. I don't know if you used the word, but engagement and ownership of in the second generation. And I want to add to that, evolution of. And then especially in the third generation, where they weren't around at all when the first generation was acquiring and coming to believe and live into these values and these principles. And so so I think what causes it to break down is a couple of things. First of all, and I got to say, you don't necessarily want to force anything on that third or fourth or fifth generation anyway. The world changes. You got to be real careful about that. If the world's changing and you're trying to force things that made sense 50 years ago, they're not going to make sense 50 years from now. And that applies to the values and core beliefs as much as it does to physical things and so on. You got to allow for evolution. Okay. And another factor that comes into evolution is, well, in my family, we like to call the outlaws, those people who marry into the family. They bring a whole half perspective, which is perfectly valid in its own right, upon those descendants. And so your kids, your grandkids, the G3, are having to deal with the fact that one grandparent passed me this value and principle, but these other grandparents and these other parents, they're doing something slightly different. And so it's hard to sort of adopt as deeply as you did in the first generation or even the second generation, because there are more factors upon you. The world has evolved. There are outlaw, genetics and outlaw principles coming into the picture. And it's going to be very hard to continue unless you allow it to evolve, unless you allow each generation to put their own stamp on it and to have it be there.
Let's talk about that. I'd like to talk about that just a bit, because my belief, Pierre, is that there are certain principles, certain kind of underlying fundamental principles that are consistent from generation to generation and need to be. So, for example, when it comes to financial wealth, one basic principle is that revenue minus expense equals profit.
Yep.
I don't care how many generations from now you go, that principle is going to stay the same.
Yep.
Right.
Yep.
The principle that if you spend more than you take in each month, you'll end up less at the end of the year. Right. I mean, there's certain fundamental principles that are not going to change. I think with values, there are also fundamental principles that don't change. Integrity is never going to go out of vogue. Doing the right thing, never going right. And maybe some might argue even with spirituality, there's some things that never change. But what is true is how you apply those principles, how you apply the principles of profit and loss statements, the mechanisms, the practices can be very different from generation to generation, right? In the sense how you apply and live out values and spirituality. So what I'm looking for is, are there some common principles or practices that you've seen? And feel free to just talk about projecting financial wealth to future generations. What are some common principles or practices that that you've seen that have been consistent from generation to generation that leaders who are listening to this could apply to their business or their families?
Well, I would say that for financial or non-financial wealth, true, genuine engagement and mentoring that is not seeking to end up replicating precisely, but mentoring that passes on the principle or the value in a way that lets the new generation take ownership of it and tolerates the fact that they're going to think about it differently without forcing it to be too rigid. Rigidity is surely a source of major problem. You got to do your P&L this way. You got to do your soup kitchen this way. Your feeding of underprivileged, hungry people this way. That's not going to work. And not only that, if you forget the this way, if you if you say, here's how we do it, and you, child, come help me do this, that's great. But turn it around. Child, how can we evolve this to fit what you're seeing at school, to fit what you see in your communities today? Open the door for engagement and mentoring that is bi-directional. It's not just me telling you, me teaching you. It's me listening, me opening the door to allow you to say it your way. And yeah, it'll need some guidance because it isn't quite right in this direction or that direction, but they'll end up in the right place if you do that in the right way. So I would say, whether it's financial or non-financial wealth, engaging in that principle, and the money and how it's handled, and mentoring in a way that allows this next generation to put their own stamp on it, to feel some ownership of it, and to evolve it in what little way it needs to evolve for them.
That's really good. So engagement and mentoring. I know you talk about the importance of involving kids in things that are important to the family early on. Can you share some additional examples of
Sure.
of how you do this, and how that happened for you?
Sure. So a great one, I think, is a philanthropic or charitable endeavor. If you in your life become very passionate about a particular soup kitchen, and maybe you just make a substantial gift every year, a financial gift to that soup kitchen, and so on. That's great. So when you have a small child, maybe a grandchild or a child, and they should be watching you make that gift. They should be participating in the making of that gift. And that might mean not just handing a check, that's pretty simplistic, but maybe going to the soup kitchen and participating in the soup kitchen. And maybe not only that, if you're not limited to one soup kitchen, ask the child to help you pick which soup kitchen, to go find the various soup kitchens. And maybe the charitable endeavor can be broader than that. Go find something that will help inner city people. Is it food? Is it shoes? Is it education? Is it homes? Give your 12-year-old the opportunity to sort of come up with some examples of each of those and give you reasons why you might pick this versus that. And then give him or her the opportunity to, okay, I agree, maybe we need to make it a little more green this way, so let's go with that one. But once you do that, let him or her go deliver the goods and see it through and participate in it there. So they take ownership, and they get some kudos for the coming to the conclusion with some guidance. They are part of it. And I think that will then, build a tradition that they will then do the same thing for their kids. And now your efforts to take care of inner city people, whether it's housing, food, or education, may have shifted from soup kitchen to housing in this one generation, but the next generation might shift over to shoes or food or whatever, but you're still taking care of inner city kids because you've let each generation kind of go where it wants to go, figure out what's appropriate for them in the world today. And of course, the world will be completely different of inner city people needing support 50 years from now anyway, right? So it's hard to mandate that you only want to do soup kitchens, and therein lies your opportunity.
But I love that example because it's a great illustration of how having an experience that each generation engages in together that lives out one of the values that's important to the family, then embeds that value in the next generation's heart. So then they figure out how to live out that value best in their context, in their city and generation.
Right? Embeds it in their hearts by letting them participate in the design of what it is in their case, and then own that, and it's theirs. In the beginning, it's not much theirs because granddad's still sitting there doing it with them, but over the 10 years between 10 years old and 20 years old, it's more and more the younger person's choice. And then in the end, it's the older person sort of sitting back and saying, yeah, great, you did it again, let me come with you when we go serve soup that day. That's all they have to do at that point. Because the younger person made the decision.
You tell a story that I heard you reference once about something that your father, I believe it was, said to you that created a paradigm of wealth transfer when you were very young for you. Can you talk a bit about that?
Sure. So I remember this day very well, and I'm not quite sure why, but I guess it's because maybe I recognized even as a 10-year-old that there was something meaningful there. And I can't put an exact year on it. I know we were in the house that my parents built in the 67, 68 timeframe, and I believe it was very quickly thereafter. So 68, 69, 70. So I would have been 10 years old approximately. We were having breakfast out in this little patio we had outside of the kitchen. I think it was breakfast. I'm pretty sure it was breakfast. And we got talking, actually, it was about the Vietnam War, oddly enough, which was sort of raging then and so on. And I have an older sister and some younger brothers. And my older sister was particularly concerned about, various questions of guns versus butter. Older folks listening to this will recognize those kinds of things. Younger folks have no clue what I just said. But, but anyway, somehow it all came back then to this question of responsibilities about this wealth that we've been lucky to inherit or receive from our ancestors. And Dad said, and I'm sure he used these first several words, and I actually put in my written stuff a whole bunch more words that I'm not sure he actually said at that time, but the first ones were very clear. The wealth, the inheritance, the trusts coming your way, coming our way, I think he said, are not entirely ours. We have a responsibility to future descendants to propagate that wealth so that they can benefit from it also. So that was the basic point. You inherit something, it's not just for you. It's not so you can have a great education, live in a comfortable house, drive a fancy car, throw great parties. Yeah, okay, you do some of those things, no problem. But you also have a responsibility to see that your children and then your grandchildren and then your great-grandchildren have similar opportunities to do those things. Now, a whole bunch of things come out of that statement. Like, whoa, wait a second. I've got to maybe spend some money, but I also got to make sure there's enough there that they can spend the same amount of money 20 years from now when they want to have their party. Oh, wow. How am I going to grow this asset? How am I going to not have it be taxed to death? How am I going to make sure the bank doesn't fail and or some criminal doesn't steal it all, or I mean, there's a whole bunch of questions that come out of this. And by the way, the family's going to do this. It's going to take from 2 to 10 to 20 to 100. Those 100 people are going to get this wealth. How are they going to be able to share this? And by the way, how are the 50 that are before that 100, how are the 50 going to make a decision as to how that wealth gets propagated? So anyway, that was the point, was he made this comment that the wealth coming your way, coming our way, is not entirely yours. You have a responsibility to see that it carries on down the tree and is to the benefit of your descendants and other members of the family every bit as much as you have benefited from.
That's so powerful, Pierre. I think I was raised with a paradigm which is, I think, much more consistent out there, which is that whatever wealth is created in one generation, whatever gets passed on to the next generation, it's basically you will it to each of your kids and maybe part of it to a charity. And it's for those people to spend, right? Like, yay, I'm glad my parents did so good. I get some money I get to increase my lifestyle with, right? But
frankly, that can very quickly become a negative. But that can very quickly become a negative. I got money coming to me to spend. That was really great. Thanks, Granny and Granddaddy. Great. Well, that's not all you want someone to say.
Yep. And I hadn't even thought otherwise until just in recent years here, getting around people like you who had some mentors or parents that gave you a different paradigm of wealth transfer. And now I'm saying, what a dramatic difference. Of course, we've completely changed our estate planning because of this different paradigm. But the concept that whatever wealth is created in one generation is for the next generation to build on, to steward, to use as a platform to bless society even more and future generations even more. That's just a very different paradigm, right? So you've seen these paradigms play out differently across the generations. Can you talk about the difference that happens between the paradigm of whatever is created in one generation being a trust that's passed it on to the next generation for them to steward wealth for future generations, versus the paradigm that I get to enjoy however I want what the prior generation created? What's the pros and cons of those two paradigms from your perspective?
Your last statement there, I get to enjoy the wealth that was created by a prior generation. Really? that seems very, I'm sorry, sort of selfish. I mean, you're not saying this, I understand, but for anyone to say that, I'm not sure you want to raise children that would say that, right? Because that arguably really isn't successful to have someone say, oh gosh, I got all this money, it's for me to live well, to be educated well, and to have a great time. Well, obviously not. No one would say that, you'd like to believe. But that's the point, is that you need to make sure it comes with guidance that doesn't allow that to be all that is said. So it's not just for me. And you give the philanthropic, the charitable example is great. So yeah, we've been supporting this soup kitchen for 25 years now, and Granny and Granddaddy have gotten a little bit old and have moved on to another life, and I'm still supporting the soup kitchen. That's great, but how is this going to happen now 20 more years from now? It's great to help the soup kitchens now and next year and the year after, but I'm sure Granny and Granddaddy, dear departed Granny and Granddaddy, they actually intended that we help soup kitchens for a long time. So how do we see that that happens? And of course, it doesn't mean, one thing that is very challenging to do is to split it evenly across the tree as the tree grows. If you gave every one of your children his or her appropriate proportion of that wealth to go take care of a soup kitchen, very quickly, like 1 or 2 generations, there's not enough wealth to make a difference to a soup kitchen. Okay, so it isn't quite that simple. And so now you get into things like governance and things like family communication. How do we come together to decide how to support 1 or 2 or 3 soup kitchens? Because it has grown. We have to support just 1, but we can't support 20 soup kitchens for each one of us, because there's not much money. So yeah, it's not just a matter of this money's come my way. You need to pass the wealth with some guidance on how to propagate it on. And that really is all it's about. It's just talking to these kids. So I'll give you, and this isn't even actually, I'm not sure this is exactly relevant to your question, but I somehow think it is. You're getting on you've been very successful, you for that matter, or maybe your father, maybe you, and you're flying on your private jet to your vacation house in Florida with your 5-year-old kid. You need to make sure the 5-year-old realizes that this is not what everyone does, and that there are very important and special reasons why we are able to be on this private jet, and the convenience that we get out of not having to go stand in security lines. But understand that no one else in that child's classroom is doing the same thing. And if you don't give him or her the context as to why and how he or she is able to be in this private jet and how exceptional it is, and the same thing applies to a soup kitchen, how exceptional it is that we are able to support this inner city charity of some sort. It's because of what Granny and Granddaddy did. And that, to me, right there says, well, hang on, man, it's not just a matter of throwing all the money in the lap. It's a matter of making sure it's wisely consumed. It's shepherded. I think you used that word. That's an important part of it.
So you're really passionate about helping families understand the purpose of money.
Yeah.
Right?
The source and the purpose. The source and the purpose.
Source and purpose. So
because the source is where there was a lot of hard work.
Yeah, it's good. So give some examples of purposes or goals for wealth, and why it's so important to be really clear on that in a family.
Examples of goals and purposes for wealth. Well, certainly a very simple, pedantic example is you've got wealth and you're propagating it down the tree in a trust or whatever structure it might be. What is its purpose? Why are you doing that? Is it just to give your 21-year-old a $100,000 check? No, not really. That doesn't sound like a very good purpose to want to propagate. But to give him or her an education, that is maybe a better purpose. To make sure that he or she has got the tools in his or her head and skills and capabilities to thrive in the world. And you, Lonnie, in particular, are pushing me and appropriately to say, and also to give back, the tools to give back to the community. But even without that in there, let's get an education, but let's make sure that our descendants are, what's the word? Self-fulfilled, self-actualized. Do you remember Maslow's triangle? Kind of getting to the top of that. Maybe that's a purpose for wealth. And there's no philanthropic anything in there. It's just, I've got this wealth. What do I want it to do to my great grandchildren? I want to make sure that they are happy, healthy people and able to live
Mm.
lives well. That's probably not a bad objective. Now, you put in there philanthropic endeavors, values and principles and so on, it becomes much more colorful, broad, valuable, and able to evolve in all kinds of ways. But yeah, you need to think about, what is that purpose? What do you want to achieve with it? Why is it there?
So in your mind, Pierre, is there any kind of overarching goal for wealth? Like what should wealth do?
I don't get this philosophical very often, and I'm not sure I've lived this philosophically or charitably, if you
I
will,
know I'm pushing you hard on it.
but ultimately to improve the world in some way, right? I guess here's the balance. If you have $1 million of wealth and you're going to propagate it down the tree, you might be able to help your grandchildren, your great grandchildren get a great education. That's good. But that $1 million could also improve the world in some way. Now, that opens a whole bunch of questions. Improving the world, what the heck? It means so many different things to so many different people. So let's not even go there. But if you said that was its purpose, then you'd want to set up, knowing that's its purpose, you got to set up the vehicle that will allow that to happen in the time frame you want it to. Do you want to just spend it all right now and do whatever we can to improve the world? Fine. But maybe you want to sort of dole it out in a way that it allows to make sort of more tactical little improvement pieces over the next 50 or 100 years in slightly a different way. So thinking about the purpose and trying to find your own overarching objectives for that wealth, that is what it's about. And I'm not going to judge anyone for that their particular charitable or education or world improving and thing is the right thing. There is no right. It's what you think you can do to make the world and your descendants a better place. I mean, isn't that kind of those two things together? Isn't that kind of what it's about?
Yep, absolutely. And I think if we look at wealth as just simply that, it's a platform that gives us the ability to potentially give future generations the opportunity to create more value for the world, and hopefully, following some of the things you just referenced, the empowerment,
Yes,
the tool,
the
mentoring,
capability to make a difference in the world.
capability. Right.
And that means
Yep,
they've got to
absolutely.
have some education. They've got to have the tools. They've got to have the decision-making wherewithal to know how to come to a rational decision. They got to do a whole bunch of things. Mentoring gets involved, education, the wise P&Ls, very simple examples. They got to know how to do a P&L to make that work.
Yep. That's so good. All right. So last question I have is just, any advice that you would give to family leaders to help us as family leaders keep each generation from being primary consumers to being real creators of wealth, right? Because that's really ultimate what we're talking about here is will our future generations be generative? Will they generate more value for the world, right?
Mm-hmm.
Or will they be primarily consumers of value somebody else
Right.
created? So what advice do you have? This is your
Yep.
parting shot here. Any advice to help family leaders like me and those that are listening to lay the foundation so that future generations can be creators rather than consumers?
You didn't intend this, and I don't even think you maybe even know this, and it just popped into my head. But I wrote an article on that a paper on that very, very purpose of sort of
Good, spit it out. I didn't know that.
raising children into wealth. And it's not really kind of what you said, but it talks about a bunch of things that you can do right that will cause them to be more empowered, that will cause them to be more generative. And it starts, actually, a friend of mine gave me this set of words, but it's very simple. As soon as they're able to walk, they're taking their little sippy cup and putting it in the sink at the end of dinner. They're involved. They're doing it from right then. Okay. And maybe you got to have a little set of steps next to the kitchen counter so they can get up and put their sippy cup in. But right there, it begins with, it's about what I can do. It's about what I have to do. It's about not what is given to me, but about how I contribute and how I participate. and having children that have a hunger maybe to participate is sort of one piece of guidance. I like that word hunger. It doesn't have to be a hunger to make money, but a hunger to make a difference, a hunger to participate, to be an active participant in this world that we're in. And that means things aren't given to you. You don't expect anything. You're not entitled. Those are some of the principles you've got to get across. And I think, starting with that little sippy cup, when you're done with it at dinner, it goes into the sink, and mom and dad don't do it for you. You do it.
That's great. It's a great analogy. And the question is, so what are the sippy cups in my adult children's lives right now? Right? I think that concept of not doing something for them that there's any way possible they could do for themselves is a valuable.
That would be the principle right there. And that may be that when that vacation time comes, you've all been taking this vacation together down in Florida. Maybe someone else ought to arrange all the travel and the logistics, not you.
That's good. Ooh, that's a good one. I remember that one.
That becomes complex. It becomes complex, I admit.
No, it's like, but even back to your sippy cup illustration, it's great because yes, the parent, there are times where the parent still needs to, in your illustration, find a step stool and push it up to the sink to empower the child to take action for themselves, right? So it doesn't mean the parent at any stage is necessarily completely disengaged. If anything, this requires more work, more thought, more intention from parents, regardless of the age of the children, right?
And in fact, let me actually, the corollary to this just came in, which is that you have to have your children see you living this way. They have to see you not expecting people to clean up after you, but to be doing it yourself. Because you can say all you want, but if you don't live it, if you don't do it, the message isn't going to be well planted.
Yeah, very good. Well, what great wisdom, Pierre. Thank you so much for sharing. And I know this is just the tip of the iceberg of the depth of wisdom from all the experience you have and the experience of multiple generations in your family. So we'll have to continue this again at some point. I really appreciate your time. And why don't you tell the audience what's the best way to connect with you if they wanted to follow up with you on anything or get a copy of that article or anything like that?
So I suffer from having a very prominent and recognizable name. So anyone who types my name into Google is going to find me second or third. But I would suggest that and it's not because of anything I did. It's just because of that name, quite honestly. But I suggest you go to LinkedIn. And if you use LinkedIn, you'll find me there. It's pretty obvious. There aren't a lot of Pierre DuPonts on LinkedIn, unfortunately. There are a couple others. Some of them cousins, some of them not. But go to LinkedIn, send me a message there. That's a very simple way to engage. And a lot of the things I've written over the years are actually there in my LinkedIn articles section, and you can find some other examples of the things we've spoken about.
Excellent. Good. And I'll be sure to include a link to your LinkedIn in the show notes for this episode also.
Absolutely right.
So thank you so much, Pierre.
This has been a lot of fun. Very interesting. And I appreciate this. And I tell you, you have pushed me in directions that I hadn't quite thought through as well as I should have. So I appreciate that. And I will be wrestling with them a little more. Maybe we'll talk more about them in a future session.
Be happy to do that. And you've pushed me in some areas too. So we're good for each other. That's how good friends work.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you. All right. Great. Bye-bye.
So Lonnie, we good? That all work for you?
We're good.
Yeah.
Yes. That was awesome. Good work.
Yeah. I got to say, you really did push me there. I hadn't thought about that. Yeah, exactly. What is the purpose of wealth generally for everyone? Oh my God.
Well, actually, I was trying to cue you up for the last question number 12, which I took from from your speech, actually, which was no, not 12, question 11, which was
I have an
you
answer
actually
to that
said
question?
You did, Pierre. You had a great answer. You gave it good on this too, but it was actually good because you stretched your thoughts around this a bit. But you said that the overriding goal of wealth is for wealth to be opportunity creating and empowering for the next generation.
Sure. No, I didn't quite come to those words, did I? Opportunity creating and empowering. Yeah, you're absolutely right. But again, no, but actually, Lonnie, I'm going to push back a little bit because you were trying to get me, I thought, to go in, because opportunity creating and empowering, I'm sorry, this is going to sound weird, is about me. I kind of thought you were trying to help me make the purpose of wealth be outside of me more.
Which I was, and I actually quoted a version of what you said by saying that the purpose of wealth is to lay the foundation so that the next generation has more opportunity to create value.
Yeah.
And is more empowered to create value. So it's, it's,
you're right.
both.
You're right. You were. And the other word I would have liked to have gotten in there is supporting communities around you. Those communities are what make you successful as a small child and as a grown adult. And so taking care of them is maybe something outside of me, outside of my family, that wealth maybe ought to do. Is take care of the communities around you, the towns, the customers, the schoolmates, all kinds of things. Anyway, another session, another podcast.
All right, great. Well, thank you, sir. So this will go off to editing, and then once I get it back, I'll send you a copy of the audio edited, and you can let me know if there's anything.
Yeah, let me listen through it. I want to make sure we, and I don't think I said anything at all that could be possibly considered dangerous or weird, but it would be good to listen.
No, I think it's great. It was great, Pierre.
Excellent. Lonnie, I appreciate this. You're the first person I've done this with. I hope to do some more, but thank you.
Okay, sounds good.
Be well.
You did a great job. Thanks, Pierre. Bye-bye.
Okay, bye-bye.